Good morning. The Subcommittee on Communications and Technology will now come to order, and the chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. And I want to welcome you to today's subcommittee hearing on rural broadband challenges and solutions. Extending the reach of broadband in rural Tennessee and across America is critical to ensure that everyone can participate in the digital economy. While the percentage of rural Tennesseans still lacking access to high-speed internet has decreased from 34% to 23%, we have to continue to push. You can't have a 21st century economy without a 21st century internet. Since passage of the 1996 Telecom Act, the private sector has invested roughly $1.6 trillion in their networks using different technologies. Understanding different technologies is key because broadband is more than just fiber. Moreover, we should acknowledge private investment in rural deployment and ensure that government-based solutions complement private investment instead of competing with it. For example, I'm pleased to have the Satellite Industry Association testifying so we can learn about the strides they're making to deploy modern satellites capable of delivering broadband internet anywhere in the country. Almost 6 months ago, I chaired a hearing on closing the digital divide. Hearings are useful, but as chairman, I like to focus on results. Today's hearing allows us to check our progress, finding solutions, and getting work done. I'm proud to report the members of this subcommittee have worked together and accomplished quite a bit when it comes to expanding broadband access in rural America. In March, Congress passed Rayburn Act, the most significant rural broadband legislation to become law in the last 6 years. The bill was named in honor of the E&C Committee Staff Director Ray Baum, who passed away earlier this year. Ray was a champion for rural America, and naming this bill for him is a fitting tribute. Rayburn Act incorporated several legislative proposals we examined at our hearing in January. I will let our subcommittee members discuss their legislative solutions, but I would like to highlight a couple that positively impact the people of Tennessee and Americans everywhere. Ms. Ashew and Mr. McKinley took the reins on broadband conduits. The idea that the Department of Transportation should facilitate broadband infrastructure on highway projects that use federal dollars. I'm pleased we could work with Ms. Ashew, who had this great idea, common sense, and we finally got it done. Mr. Kinzinger and Mr. Loebsack worked together to require the FCC to study the potential of using spectrum more efficiently for rural areas. Lastly, our full committee, Chairman Greg Walden, took on the difficult issue of ensuring the solvency of the Broadcasters Relocation Fund. Wireless broadband providers spent over $19.8 billion at auction for TV spectrum. Ensuring the solvency of the relocation fund is crucial to getting this spectrum to use for broadband, especially in rural areas. After passage of Rayburn Act, the subcommittee passed 2 more rural broadband bills: the Precision Ag Connectivity Act from Mr. Latta and Mr. Loebsack, the Access Broadband Act from Mr. Tonko and Mr. Lance. These bills were reported out of full committee last week. All of this shows that Congress can, in fact, roll up our sleeves and get things done. Rural broadband remains a challenge, and there are still unserved areas that need to be connected. With limited federal dollars to go around, we simply cannot afford to allow overbuilding to take place while so many areas are left completely unserved. We need to encourage states to find solutions that best suit their needs. We'll not stop working, and I'm proud to lead the subcommittee in working with the president to find good bipartisan solutions. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Lance.
Thank you, Chairman Blackburn. I have introduced the Airwaves Act with Ranking Member Doyle, which, among other things, would help spur rural broadband deployment by dedicating 10% of spectrum auction proceeds under the bill to rural broadband. Had this rural dividend been in place during the previous 2 spectrum auctions, over $6 billion would have been raised for rural bailout. Build-out. I think that it's incredibly important that rural America be treated the same way as the rest of America. It is also important that we recognize that any federal funds for broadband deployment will be finite. I've worked hard to pursue policies to ensure coordination between various agencies. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to introduce a coalition letter of support for the Airwaves Act, and it includes the African American Mayors Association, the American Library Association, the National Black Chamber of Commerce, and the Taxpayer Protection Alliance.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, I recognize Mr. Doyle for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I get started, I want to express my deepest condolences to Robin Colwell, the majority's chief counsel, on the passing of her husband, Bill. I know Robin and her family are grieving their loss, but our thoughts and prayers are with her and her family. Madam Chair, thank you for holding this hearing. We live in a divided nation when it comes to broadband access. All too often, people living in urban areas are the digital haves, whereas those living in rural areas are being left behind with few or no choices, higher prices, and lower speeds. As I and many of our colleagues have said in the past, if we're going to bring more broadband to rural America, our government needs to make a sustained investment in building out more infrastructure. That's why I'm proud to support Ranking Member Pallone's Lift America Act, which would dedicate $40 billion to building out broadband infrastructure in the unserved and underserved parts of the country. We also need to give communities like Pine Tops the freedom and flexibility to provision their own service. That's why I'm proud to continue to support Ms. Eshu's Community Broadband Act. Ms. Corker-Craig, reading your testimony, reiterates exactly why this is such an important option for rural communities. I'm also proud to have introduced the Airwaves Act with Mr. Lance. This bill directs the FCC to conduct a number of spectrum auctions, as well as to make significant amounts of new unlicensed spectrum available. The bill would set aside a portion of the revenue from those auctions for the deployment of new wireless broadband infrastructure in served and underserved parts of rural America. Mr. Aiken discusses in his testimony a number of the bands in the bill which would be ideal for build-out of broadband in rural areas, specifically the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, or CBRS, and the lower C-band. It's important to keep in mind that these bands could be structured in a way that would enhance rural broadband deployment, but they don't have to be. The Commission has currently considered changes to both these bands. The CBRS band was envisioned as a model for an innovative new spectrum licensing system that would cover smaller areas than traditional cellular licenses. This licensing model was supported by a broad range of industries, including rural broadband providers, who see tremendous potential in being able to access smaller, more affordable blocks of licensed spectrum. But the Commission is considering changes to this band that would drastically increase license sizes, crowding out smaller players so that only the largest wireless providers could bid on these licenses. The Commission also opened up a proceeding on the lower C-band. Several satellite companies that operate in this band have proposed making a portion of the band available for mobile broadband, which is great. But I agree with Mr. Aiken that this band has a lot more potential. The rest of the band could be shared between satellite operators and broadband providers using fixed wireless service. This proposal has the potential to greatly expand broadband deployment in rural parts of the country. In both of these bands, the Commission has before it two roads. They can work to make as much spectrum available for mobile broadband services. At the last hearing we had on that topic, every witness acknowledged 5G would not solve rural-urban broadband divide. Or the FCC can adopt spectrum policies that brings broadband to all Americans. I think it's important for members on this subcommittee to realize that these are the decisions that the Commission is making right now that could affect the future of broadband in rural communities. And with that, Madam Chair, I want to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Butterfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doyle, for yielding time this morning, and thank all of the witnesses for their testimony. You know, Madam Chairman, one of the privileges extended to members of this committee is to introduce their constituents when the committee invites them to testify. So you can imagine my surprise when I learned that the committee had extended an invitation to one of my constituents from the town of Pine Tops, North Carolina, population 1,300, to serve as a witness for today's hearing on rural broadband. The town is a small rural community located in my district in Edgecombe County. The town, with a population of 1,300, comprises an area of about 1 square mile. In fact, I was in the town on Saturday night. I passed through there quite often. I stopped at Abrams Barbecue, and former Sheriff James Knight was there, and he bought me a plate of barbecue slaw and hush puppies just this past Saturday night. Pine Tops, Madam Chairman, is home to my constituent, Suzanne Coker Craig, who accepted the committee's invitation to testify. Ms. Craig and her husband, Doug, are small business owners in the town. Before starting her business in 2010 that continues to grow, Ms. Craig was Director of Advocacy Programs for the North Carolina Hospital Association. She served as Pine Tops Town Commissioner from 2009 to 2017, played a key role in securing high-speed internet service for the constituents in the town. And so I'm proud to welcome Suzanne to the committee. Suzanne will share with her experience of living in an extremely rural community and the challenges that she and others face when not connected to the digital world. Thank you for yielding this time, Madam Chairman and Mr. Doyle. At this time, I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, I recognize Mr. Walden, Chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for an opening.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank my colleagues and certainly our panelists for being here today. Mr. Butterfield, we would have thought we'd get to sample some of that fine barbecue from, yeah, okay, we got that on the record. I want to welcome our witnesses, as I said, and really appreciate your being here. In particular, I want to thank my constituent, Ms. Jenny Ward from the Wallowa Memorial Hospital, from coming here all the way from Wallowa County. She's there in Enterprise, a population of 1,916 people. And the county with 6,800 people spans 3,152 square miles. So this is big, wide open country, beautiful mountain ranges and forests and farmland. It's tucked in the far northeast corner of Oregon. It's larger than the state of Delaware and very rugged and remote. I've worked over the years with the health center there and the hospital and others on their efforts to build out fiber and get really good connectivity. We recently worked together with the FCC. Chairman Ajit Pai was in Oregon just after he announced he was raising the cap on the FCC's rural health care program. This really helps the folks in Wallowa County Health Care District and other rural providers to get affordable broadband service. Ms. Ward will detail the telehealth opportunities that broadband access has opened up, and most importantly, expanding the care patients can receive locally without having to travel hours to other hospitals. This is certainly a huge benefit in a place where, as a county commissioner once told me, Susan Roberts, it's winter 11 months out of the year, and sometimes it snows in August. That's true. Telemedicine, however, is only one example of the opportunities provided by broadband access in our rural communities all across America. Eastern Oregon University, Blue Mountain Community College, and others are taking advantage of distance learning to expand access to higher education to isolated communities. Farmers and ranchers across America, and certainly my district, are using precision agriculture more and more to regulate their inputs. And the transition to next-gen 911 is critical for strengthening public policy. After all, broadband is the infrastructure investment of the 21st century. Broadband means jobs, and jobs come from deployment of broadband, including towers and cell sites, fiber, launching satellites, upgrading facilities, constitute the physical infrastructure. And the economic benefits don't stop at that infrastructure investment. Maintaining this infrastructure requires high-skilled jobs in engineering, network management, cybersecurity, advertising, community service, customer service, and much more. Beyond all that, we know broadband's a force multiplier for job creation and providing efficiencies for every sector of the economy. Our chair ran through some of the bills included in the Ray Bombs Act, but the chair herself deserves credit for spearheading the overall effort. This legislation, now law, included many provisions to improve broadband build-out. Spectrum auctions, for example. Spectrum auctions raise billions of dollars in federal revenue for deficit reduction and other investments, but a quirk in the law prevented the FCC from taking upfront payments of auction bidders and depositing the money directly with the U.S. Treasury. Though spectrum is the lifeblood of wireless broadband, this effectively stopped the FCC from conducting further spectrum auctions. So this committee, and under the chair's leadership, took care of that in the Ray Baum's Act. Ray Baum's Act fixed this by including a bipartisan bill for Mr. Guthrie and Ms. Matsui that allows the FCC to deposit legally upfront payments directly with the Treasury. And as a result, the FCC is now moving forward with its upcoming Spectrum Frontiers auction, which will make more high-band spectrum available for 5G. Ray Baum's Act, signed into law March 23rd. As you've heard, I have a feeling the bill's namesake, Ray, who was from Eastern Oregon and actually represented Wallowa and Union counties in the state legislature and called them God's country, be very proud of our efforts then and now. And while some may have been content with that accomplishment that we did earlier this year, this subcommittee continues to process important bills through regular order, and just last week, the full committee took up 4 more bills that were unanimously approved by this subcommittee. So these bipartisan bills include Mr. Tonko and Mr. Lance's Access Broadband Act, which is an important and necessary step to coordinate funding for broadband across different agencies. We also passed Mr. Latta and Mr. Lobsak's Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act, which requires the FCC and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to form a task force to evaluate the best ways to leverage broadband for modern high-tech farming and ranching. These bills illustrate what we can accomplish when we work together, as we do often on a bipartisan basis. However, other members have put forward bills to address rural broadband challenges, and these proposals will deserve our attention and consideration as well. And I expect we'll hear about some of those today, and we'll continue to work on those. Look forward to this hearing as a follow-up to our January hearing on closing the digital divide and the numerous other infrastructure-related hearings we've conducted this Congress. So we've got more work to do to improve access for telehealth, precision agriculture, education, and jobs across America. But I want to thank Ms. Word for being here today. We really appreciate your coming out. Look forward to your testimony. I'll say in advance we have another hearing going on at the same time, so I'll be bouncing back and forth. But we have the testimony from all of you, and we appreciate your input. Well, Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Pallone, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. From the start of the Trump administration, there has been a bipartisan call to modernize America's infrastructure, including expanding broadband to communities that need it. And this takes significant resources and cannot be done simply through deregulation or streamlining processes. Actual investments are needed, and we must see states and local governments as partners, not adversaries. Committee Democrats recognize the need for real investment and develop legislative proposals to build the modern, resilient infrastructure that Americans need and deserve. First, the Lift America Act authorizes $40 billion in grants for the deployment of secure and resilient broadband. This comprehensive infrastructure bill, which is supported by every Democrat on this committee, also invests in drinking water infrastructure, energy infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, and brownfields redevelopment. And these investments will make Americans more competitive, safer, healthier, and connected. Second, Mr. Lujan, along with a number of other Democrats on the committee, introduced the Broadband Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, and this bill would authorize $5 billion worth of secured loans, loan guarantees, and lines of credit to finance public-private partnerships for broadband deployment. Third, Mr. Tonko has introduced the Access Broadband Act, which was just reported by this committee to the full House of Representatives last week. And this bill would create an Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth to help ensure we're using existing broadband programs and new ones to get the most bang for the buck. And I urge my colleagues to bring this bill to the House floor as soon as possible. Committee Democrats have also put forward many other innovative solutions that could make a real change in connecting the unconnected and opening up our airways for new wireless broadband services. Unfortunately, the administration and my Republican colleagues have placed infrastructure legislation on the back burner behind its tax scam that benefits large corporations and the wealthiest few. Rather than making real and substantial investments in our nation's crumbling infrastructure, they instead choose to throw billions of dollars in tax breaks at the wealthy who simply do not need them. So I think we need to invest in broadband infrastructure, particularly in rural and urban communities that have been left behind. According to the FCC, 30% of Americans in rural areas and 35% of Americans living on tribal lands lack access to baseline broadband service. And this is based on mapping data that we know underreports the scope of the problem. So it's time to act. Democrats have bold proposals that will actually drive broadband deployment in all 50 states. These proposals are technologically neutral and open the door to all internet service providers that can deliver fast and secure broadband access. We need to think outside the box in our effort to connect all Americans to the benefits of the internet. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how we can ensure access to high-speed broadband throughout America, including rural communities. And on a brief personal note, if I could just say, I was incredibly saddened to hear that Robin Caldwell of the subcommittee's majority staff lost her husband, Bill, over the weekend following his battle with cancer. And I want to offer our deepest condolences from the Democratic side and sympathies to her and her family in this trying time. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Is anyone seeking to? No one seeking to claim his time, and we appreciate so much the thoughts and condolences for Robin, and we know that you all wish Robin and her girls well during this sad time. This concludes our member opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. We want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to accept the invitation and come before the subcommittee. Today's witnesses will have the opportunity to give their opening statements, followed by a round of questions. Our panel for today's hearing will include Mr. Tom Strout, President of the Satellite Industry Association, Mr. Justin Fordy, Senior Director of Government Relations at Midco, Mr. Claude Aiken, President and CEO of the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, Mr. John May, President of Ag Solutions and the Chief Information Officer at John Deere and Company, Ms. Jenny Word, Associate Administrator and Chief Nursing Officer at Wallowa Memorial Hospital in Oregon, and Ms. Suzanne Coker-Craig, a former commissioner of the town of Pinetops and the current managing partner at Curiosities of Pinetops. We appreciate each of you being here today, and we appreciate your testimony. We will begin with you, Mr. Strout. 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me testify here today. I'm Tom Strout, President of the Satellite Industry Association. Satellite communications services are positioned to be the keystone for bringing 21st century broadband capabilities to the entirety of the United States. These services are capable of providing broadband to rural and remote areas of the country where it remains uneconomical for terrestrial services to deploy and provide both speeds and prices comparable to terrestrial alternatives. These services are available directly to the consumer today, covering all 50 states and delivering broadband offerings up to 100 megabits per second. Satellite broadband is also used by business and government enterprises for both fixed and mobile purposes, using a range of spectral bands to deliver assured access to broadband communications. Further, satellites are providing critical backhaul internet connectivity to local internet service providers and community institutions in remote locations. Today, approximately 2 million customers nationwide are enjoying high-quality satellite broadband services at reasonable rates and at speeds that meet and exceed the FCC's definition of broadband service. The satellite industry is investing tens of billions of dollars to innovate and increase broadband connectivity to the U.S. and across the globe. High-throughput satellites, for example, relying on frequency reuse and spot beam technology to produce increased output factors upward of 20 times that of traditional satellites. The industry has seen similar increases in the capacity of its systems. The first broadband satellite began service in 2008 with a capacity of 10 gigabits per second. Today's satellites have capacities of up to 260 gigabits per second, a number expected to increase to 1,000 gigabits per second by the end of the decade. These terabit capacity geostationary satellites will provide orders of magnitude capacity increases. In another highly anticipated advancement in the industry, thousands of new high-throughput non-geostationary satellites will soon join existing operators in low Earth and medium Earth orbits to provide additional high-speed broadband at low latency levels. Indeed, prototypes of these satellites have already begun to launch. As Congress develops its broadband policies, it should consider the many positive attributes of satellite broadband. These include, number one, competition. Just as it has with radio and television services in the past, satellite services provide market-based competition to terrestrial broadband services. Satellite broadband brings additional package options, pricing, and innovative services to consumers, often in areas with only a single or small number of providers. Number two, wide geographic coverage. To address the digital divide, broadband services need to be available for the most rural and remote areas of the country. The nature of satellite's wide coverage ensures that all communities within the satellite's footprint receive the same quality of service, whether they are remote communities or big cities. Public policy makers should leverage terrestrial-style incentives with satellite's geographically independent cost structure to achieve universal communication services. Number three, availability. Unlike terrestrial service, satellite broadband is available today across a significant portion of the country without the build-out of additional infrastructure. Customers can obtain satellite broadband services by simply ordering and awaiting at-home installation. Number four, cost efficiency. Because satellite systems have inherently wide area coverage, when technology-neutral incentives are made to encourage capacity redirection, there is no additional cost to build out to rural and remote areas, only lost opportunity costs in more lucrative service areas. This is unlike terrestrial services, where the low density of rural and remote areas makes it costlier and in most cases not economically viable to build out and cover these areas. And five, reliability. Natural and man-made disasters can interrupt terrestrial broadband services. Satellites, however, are less affected by these events, and satellite ground systems or satellite-enabled airborne equipment can be quickly deployed to restore connectivity. Of course, all of the breakthroughs we've seen because of satellite technologies should not be taken for granted. They depend upon our industry's ability to access spectrum. In order for our industry to sustain and meet the growing demand for satellite services, we encourage regulators to continue to allocate sufficient spectrum for satellite use and to support the National Broadband Mapping System as to provide a clear and complete map of broadband services. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Forty, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the challenges we face and the solutions we are working on to bring the benefits of broadband to rural America. My name is Justin Forty, and I'm the Senior Director of Government Relations for Midco. Midco is the leading provider of internet and networking, cable TV, phone, data center, home security, and advertising services in the Upper Midwest. We serve more than 385,000 residential and business customers in South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Kansas, and Wisconsin, in communities ranging in size from less than 100 people to more than 180,000. Midco has a history of innovation in the Upper Midwest that continues to motivate our business today. In 2017, we launched the Midco Gig Initiative, a commitment to bring gigabit internet speeds to our entire service area. We have invested over $56 million in the Gig Initiative, over and above the millions of dollars we invest in our network annually. Today, Midco Gig is available to more than 80% of our customers, with more communities to come in 2018. We are also focused on expanding our service to more cities and more communities across the region. But there are challenges and high costs associated with building fiber in our area of the country. While thinking about a creative solution to this challenge, we were contacted by the rural community of Brooktree Park, North Dakota, to help them obtain broadband access. We quickly determined that bringing wireline service to the area was not economically feasible, but we partnered with Invisimax, a fixed wireless provider, and we were able to offer broadband service to that area within 30 days. Recognizing the potential of the fixed wireless solution to provide broadband to more rural residents, Midco has acquired Invisimax, and we've begun to expand fixed broadband wireless with service more broadly in rural areas within our footprint. Fixed wireless allows us to reach areas that are up to 50 miles away from our fiber network, and we can implement that solution relatively quickly without the expense of constructing fiber networks. We can use fixed wireless to offer internet where the terrain can make it difficult, if not impossible, to provide wire internet, such as the Badlands of North and South Dakota, the granite fields of northern Minnesota, or the limestone cliffs in eastern Minnesota. We can also reach vast areas of farmland where it is not economically feasible to run fiber to every single acre. We can deploy new fixed wireless during the winter months when difficult winters make new fiber construction impossible. I myself am a Midco fixed wireless customer. I get my internet from the top of a grain elevator in Prosper, North Dakota, to my small farmstead 6 miles west of Argusville, North Dakota. On a normal day, my 3 kids are streaming video or other content, while my wife is using the internet to run a small business. This service has been a great asset to our family. Even today, it allows me to keep an eye on the farm from Washington, D.C. through a video and security system enabled by fixed wireless. Midco supports your hard work to ensure that all Americans have access to broadband services. We greatly appreciate the bipartisan commitment of this committee to produce bills that nurture a broadband deployment-friendly atmosphere. Your efforts in the Rayburn Act and the Mobile Now Act to include broadband deployment provisions like the Dig Once policy and a spectrum policy balancing licensed and unlicensed uses, your thoughtful consideration of the Access Broadband Act have contributed to an environment which we are more able to easily invest, expand, and deploy. Today, I'd like to offer 2 suggestions for how you might help us further advance the reach of broadband networks. First, in some cases, government help is needed to bring broadband access to areas that is not financially viable to build. In the past, some broadband funding programs have allowed funds to be used in places that already have broadband service. We were encouraged to see the pilot funding program in the Omnibus Appropriations Act and in the Senate Farm Bill that both seek to limit funding to areas that need it most. We ask your support efforts to keep broadband funding dollars to unserved areas. Second, to serve the greatest number of rural residents via fixed wireless, we must have the ability to purchase spectrum. We need more wide channels and spectrum bands where we receive interference protection, and we must have a fair ability to compete for access to any spectrum that is open and appropriate for fixed wireless service. Congress should support the FCC in its effort to expand the categories of eligible uses for certain underutilized spectrum bands like 2.5 gigahertz and support the FCC in adopting smaller license sizes and appropriate auction rules for bands that have potential for fixed wireless in rural areas. These actions will help all Americans, including those in rural America, to receive the full potential of America's broadband networks. Thank you again for inviting me here today, and I look forward to working with all of you on these important issues.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Aiken, you're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Claude Aiken, President and CEO of WISPA, the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, representing more than 800 small businesses who are closing the digital divide in rural America. I'm honored to offer our perspective on how fixed wireless broadband is making a difference in rural America. The majority of our members got their start the same way. They were bootstrapping entrepreneurs who saw the need for better broadband in their communities and answered the call. Whether it was via maxed out personal credit cards, small loans from family members, or putting their life savings on the line, our members have built workable, cost-efficient local networks and given their neighbors what they never had before: high-speed broadband internet. Our members use whatever spectrum is available, unlicensed, lightly licensed, or licensed spectrum. They lease whatever infrastructure is available to hang radios. It may be commercial towers, local water towers, or a neighbor's grain silo or barn. They transmit internet data often over many miles to small fixed receivers on their customers' premises. And they provide high-speed, low-latency, uncapped broadband, typically in the range of 5 to 50 megabits per second, and speeds of up to 1 gigabit per second are possible with current technology. Our members are overwhelmingly small, local, rural providers. More than half have fewer than 1,000 customers. Almost 3/4 have fewer than 10 employees. But despite their small size, they are making a difference, serving more than 4 million people across our nation. And the majority do this without any government subsidies. Most importantly, WISPs can deploy fixed wireless service to residential consumers at about 1/7 the cost of fiber and 1/4 the cost of cable. That's right, we can deploy broadband for a fraction of the cost of fiber and cable, and we can deploy much more quickly, usually in months rather than years. Clearly, we are a significant part of the solution. So how can we in DC help unleash the power of fixed wireless economics to better serve your communities? The most important thing the subcommittee can do is to support more flexible, shared, and lightly licensed use of underutilized spectrum bands. Our members are often frustrated that they have potential customers within range of their towers, but insufficient spectrum to serve them. All the while, licensed spectrum in their areas goes unused. Thankfully, the subcommittee has been a part of the solution. We commend your work to lower barriers to infrastructure deployment, streamline regulations, and widen the spectrum pipeline. Legislation like the Airwaves Act and the Access Broadband Act will make a difference in rural America. WISPA also commends the FCC for moving forward on rulemaking proceedings that could and should make more spectrum available for rural broadband deployment. The FCC is at a critical juncture on one proceeding that I will briefly highlight, the ongoing Citizens Broadband Radio Service, or CBRS, proceeding. It is no exaggeration to say that this proceeding is vitally important to the future of rural broadband. In 2015, the FCC adopted innovative rules that would have auctioned 7 10 megahertz spectrum licenses in blocks the size of census tracts, about 4,000 people each. But last summer, the FCC reopened the rules, seeking comment on greatly enlarging the license areas up to the size of a partial economic area, which can generally contain both urban and rural areas and often cross state lines. For our members, enlarging the license areas would be like requiring an entrepreneur who wants to open a kiosk to purchase an entire shopping mall. Our members need the FCC to keep the existing unlicensed or GAA spectrum allocation intact and retain small census tract size licenses in the CBRS band. This would increase auction participation and revenues and enable our members and all kinds of entrepreneurs and innovators to participate in the auction, not just our largest companies. And here's another reason why balanced spectrum policy is so important. If rural service can be deployed at much lower cost by fixed wireless providers, there is much less need for doling out subsidies to large carriers to offset their much higher costs. For example, Zirkle Wireless in Colorado is serving areas with 1 person per square mile without any government subsidies. With the right spectrum policy, access to private capital will become easier for small providers, and broadband deployment in rural and small-town America will accelerate. To the extent subsidies are necessary, they should be made available in a technology-neutral and a provider-neutral manner. Too often, small WISPs find themselves overbuilt by providers receiving state or federal subsidies. We need to work together to find solutions that will prevent small companies that have invested private capital from facing competition from large companies backed with government subsidies, grants, and loans. Madam Chairman, our members are closing the rural broadband gap without subsidies, and we call on you to help modernize and rebalance U.S. spectrum policies so that we can reach even more Americans in underserved areas. We thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. May, you're recognized.
Chairman Blackburn and Ranking Member Doyle, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and speak about rural broadband, a very important issue for many farmers and others in the agricultural sector. My company, John Deere, is the global leader in manufacture of agricultural, construction, turf, and forestry equipment. For 181 years, Deere has been helping farmers get more production from their fields in an efficient and sustainable manner. Technology, a big part of agriculture and the John Deere story, is the key to helping farmers meet the world's needs for food and agricultural goods in the future. And having access to broadband internet services is absolutely essential to leveraging the benefits that technology has to offer. The evolution of technology in agriculture is critical. That's because global demand for agricultural output, which has more than tripled since 1960, shows no signs of easing. Given forecasts of global population growth and dietary improvements, farm output will need to roughly double from 2000 levels to meet the projected demand in 2050. What's more, these output gains will need to take place with essentially the same amount of land and water and probably less labor. By and large, the technologies needed to produce these gains depend on the delivery of reliable internet connections to farmers in the field, something many farmers can't count on today. The extent of the broadband access problem in agriculture is hard to measure in exact terms, but we know anecdotally it's a significant issue. Based on the rate of successful connections between our John Deere customers and our data management platforms, We know there are many instances where producers cannot fully leverage the benefits of their data on account of non-existent or unreliable internet service. This is to say nothing about connections that are never made or even attempted by those who lack internet service and don't bother to invest in the technologies in the first place. The nature and the extent of the problem is exactly why we believe federal policy and programs should give more consideration to the needs of farmers and ranchers. Without a better understanding of the problem, we can't begin to design the right solution. John Deere commends the Energy and Commerce Committee's approval of H.R. 4881, the Precision Agricultural Connectivity Act. Along with our partners in the Agricultural Broadband Coalition, John Deere endorsed the bill. We see it as an important first step to addressing agricultural broadband issue. We are hopeful this legislation will be enacted this year either as part of the Farm Bill or on its own. We also believe federal agencies with broadband deployment mandates should view access through an expanded lens, one that incorporates a geographic and functional usage metric, as opposed to looking only at population centers. In our view, broadband access on active cropland should be included as a metric for identifying areas where broadband infrastructure investment is most needed. Cell towers are, for the time being, the key for delivering high-speed LTE terrestrial signals, and we need more of them over croplands and ranchlands. As you know, farms represent a significant source of commercial activity in rural communities. Owners, employees, buyers, vendors, and service providers all conduct business in and around the farm operations. Supporting increased wireless broadband deployment in the very places where farming activities occurs, in the fields, will bring many benefits to rural communities. These include increased economic growth, improved environmental stewardship, and enhanced food security. John Deere's higher purpose or mission is to help people live better lives through our commitment to those that are linked to the land. Today, we are expressing that commitment in the many ways we are developing and using technology, almost all of which is digital in nature and internet-based. That will help feed the world in a sustainable manner for generations to come. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
We thank the gentleman. Ms. Word, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Jenny Word. I serve as the Associate Administrator and Chief Nursing Officer at Wallowa Memorial Hospital in Enterprise, Oregon. Our facility is a 25-bed critical access hospital and level 4 trauma center. I am proud to report we have been named one of the top 20 critical access hospitals in the nation for the past 2 years. Our hospital serves Wallowa County, and as Congressman Walden referred to before, has a population of just under 7,000 people spread over 3,152 square miles in frontier northeastern Oregon. That's a population density of 2.2 persons per square mile. The next nearest hospital, also a critical access hospital, is 65 miles away. I would like to focus my testimony on the important role broadband plays in bringing telehealth services to rural and frontier areas. Our hospital provides a wide array of services, but not all the services our community needs. Telehealth has enabled us to fill this gap and ensure access to high-quality care in our frontier county. In my written testimony, I provided 3 examples that illustrate the life-saving role telehealth can play in areas like ours. Broadband infrastructure is a foundation on which providers like ours can use telehealth technology to meet health crises like these. Moving forward, reliable, affordable broadband in homes and remote rural hospitals and clinics will be critical as we transform the current healthcare delivery system. Our goal is a system that effectively coordinates care for our patients, rewards value, improves quality and patient safety, and reduces costs. Broadband is the linchpin of that effort. We are fortunate in Wallowa County to have good broadband infrastructure, but even so, our county has many remote areas that do not yet have broadband connectivity. Nationwide, the Federal Communications Commission reports that 34 million Americans still lack access to adequate broadband. Oregon has made significant progress in the deployment of broadband connectivity. However, a 2014 survey of broadband adoption in Oregon found that rural areas lag behind their urban neighbors in having access to broadband connectivity, and rural residents are less likely than their urban counterparts to use broadband technologies. The Mississippi State Extension Service Index identified Wallowa County as one of 10 Oregon counties with the highest digital divide index. Congress took steps in the fiscal year 18 omnibus appropriations bill to address the digital divide, and the FCC recently increased funding available through the Rural Healthcare Program, which supports broadband adoption for the nonprofit rural healthcare providers. We applaud both of these actions and thank you for your role in making them a reality. As these programs are implemented, we look forward to taking advantage of these new resources. Finally, I'd like to say something about telehealth. The potential for telehealth to expand access to medical treatment seems limitless, especially in rural and frontier areas where vast distances make it difficult to get to a doctor or to a hospital. However, there are barriers preventing us from realizing that potential. For example, Medicare payment policy restricts sites eligible for reimbursement, limits distant site providers, and restricts the services for which Medicare will reimburse. Medicare does not reimburse for remote patient monitoring, a potentially vital tool in monitoring patients with chronic conditions, especially those in rural areas. Medicare also doesn't reimburse for phone, email, fax-based services, or store and forward technology. Providers would like these geographic and setting location requirements eliminated, and expansion of the types of technology that can be used, and coverage for all services that are safe to provide. Rural communities also need additional capital to develop telehealth capabilities, as well as adequate funding to operate systems once they are up and running. I am pleased that the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 expanded Medicare coverage for telestroke and provided waivers for some alternative payment models, but more should be done. Every week, it seems, new technologies become available to help patient needs. The use of telehealth and other new technologies will improve access to health care, improve outcomes, and reduce costs. Public policy should not hold us back as we seek to realize the potential these new technologies hold. I applaud the committee and its chair and my Congressman Greg Walden for the leadership it has shown in addressing these challenges. There is certainly more work to do, and Wallowa Memorial Hospital and other rural hospitals stand ready to work with you in that effort. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Ms. Coker-Craig, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Microphone, just
thank you.
Well, pull it closer and punch it once so we can get it on.
It's on now.
Okay.
So, thank you all for your invitation this morning. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you to Congressman Butterfield for the introduction. Glad to hear you're hanging out at Abrams. My name is Suzanne Coker-Craig, and I'm a small business owner and former commissioner in the town of Pine Tops, North Carolina. Our little town is 65 miles east of Raleigh and is centrally located between Greenville, Wilson, and Rocky Mount. We have a significant number of our residents who live well below the poverty level, and we're located in Edgecombe County, which is one of the poorest counties in the state. Unlike much of North Carolina, our local population has declined over the last 20 years, and we struggle to attract and keep college-educated people as well as small businesses and small industry in our area. Even with all of these challenges, Pine Tops is a wonderful community in what I consider to be the best part of North Carolina. We have all the benefits of small-town life, but are an easy drive to small cities around us. We're a great place to live and to raise a family, and in March of 2016, our little town got symmetrical gigabit-speed broadband internet service that made my 25-year-old nephew in Raleigh jealous. But our own state legislature has constantly fought to disconnect us and take away the best economic, educational, and lifestyle benefit we've had in 50 years. Like most small areas, ours got left way behind in the technology boom. As the internet exploded, we struggled to get much more than a dial-up connection. Our only provider showed little interest in upgrading their antiquated services beyond what they billed as high-speed internet, which was defined as up to 10 megabits of service. Speed tests commonly showed that was really between 4 and 6 megabits download with less than 1 megabit upload, and that was within a quarter mile of their hub. This would have been great service in 2000, but in 2015 there was a serious challenge to running a small business and providing access to modern education or health care. Other providers served nearby towns in our area, but were not at all interested in serving Pine Tops. So around 2008, the city of Wilson, which is 17 miles west and in neighboring Wilson County, began providing gigabit speed fiber to the premises internet service to their citizens. They borrowed money from private investors and have repaid them with revenues from the network without using taxpayer dollars. The city of Wilson has provided electric service to the town of Pine Tops for well over 40 years and has been a great partner for our little town. So we asked Wilson if they could bring that fantastic internet service our way. Well, in 2011, the North Carolina General Assembly passed a law that not only put significant restrictions on building municipal broadband networks, but also specified that Wilson could not take their network beyond the Wilson County line, which was 6 miles away from Pine Tops. So we were sentenced by our own legislature to being 6 short miles away from technology that could help us help ourselves. In 2015, the FCC preempted that state law and opened a window for Pine Tops to invite Wilson to bring their internet service, which is called Greenlight, to us. So in March of 2016, Pine Tops residents eagerly began signing on as Greenlight customers. I spoke with several people in town who telecommute or have small businesses, and the difference in service was amazing. One neighbor who works for a large banking operation described downloading and uploading her daily work files in 15 minutes instead of the hours it had taken with the fastest service that CenturyLink could provide. A small furniture manufacturer in town reported downloading large files from international customers in an hour or 2, rather than the 12+ hours it had taken earlier. A local fire chief was able to use for the first time online video resources to train his volunteer firemen. Families with multiple children no longer had to timeshare to finish their online assignments. The service was fantastic, and we on the town board were working to promote Pine Tops as the little town with symmetrical gigabit internet service. But once again, our legislature betrayed us. The state sued to overturn the FCC's ruling, and they won. Greenlight would have to be forced to leave Pine Tops, and we'd be forced to take 10 giant steps back economically. About the same time, Hurricane Matthew hit, and we were flooded terribly. The Greenlight techs were there within hours of the roads opening and hooking up the emergency shelters and the disaster operations. Our town board, with the enthusiastic backing of the residents and business, were eager to fight to keep Greenlight, and so we were able to get an exemption with a lot of fighting that would allow Pine Tops to keep Greenlight, but if another provider came in providing fiber services, Greenlight would have to leave, and we couldn't get language in the legislation that would make that service have to be comparable or serve everyone in town. So we got the exemption, and we were happy with that, but now Suddenlink has decided that since they didn't want to serve us with basic service, now they're bringing fiber to Pine Tops. So Greenlight has to leave. Good internet service in today's economy is as essential as electric power was in the 40s and 50s. Rural areas and small towns then had to be creative and resourceful and rely on municipalities and co-ops to provide electricity in areas that private providers weren't willing to serve. If not for the forward-thinking leaders of that time, it's hard to imagine how small-town America would have survived. We still have to be creative and resourceful in keeping our towns alive. We have to be given the freedom to use all the tools we have. I need to emphasize that while Pine Tops now has broadband access, that great service is limited to our 1-mile square town limits. Wilson would be connecting those homes in small towns and farms and outlying areas if the state barriers didn't exist. The solution to getting rural communities connected will not come from one-size-fits-all legislation. It will not come from waiting for large providers to come to our communities.
Ladies' time has expired. If you can wrap up.
Yes, ma'am. Sorry about that.
You are perfectly fine. We are so appreciative that each of you are here. We appreciate your testimony. This concludes our testimony, and we will now move into our Q&A portion of our hearing, and I will yield myself 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Strout and Mr. Aiken, I want to start with you. In your testimony, you mentioned existing alternatives in the marketplace to a big government approach that removes the ability for states to make important decisions that directly impact their financial health. And One of the bills that does cause me concern is the Community Broadband Act, which I think would threaten to undo much of the progress that is being made across the country. And the bill is essentially a further-reaching version of the FCC's failed 2015 municipal broadband order, which basically preempted the fiscally responsible measures that Tennessee had put in place regarding municipal networks. So Mr. Strout, can you expand on the differences, the specific advances that some of your member companies have made in recent years that have positioned them to be competitors in the broadband market across the country? And is there anything additional that we can do to help increase competition? And then, Mr. Aiken, to you, kind of looking in that same vein, but from the wireless side, talk about how fixed wireless has become a viable alternative, and are there specific examples that might be illustrative to the committee? So, Mr. Strout, to you first, please, sir.
Yes, as I noted in my testimony, certainly the most important things that our members have done is to increase the capacity of the satellites that have been launched, as well as the speed, which ultimately makes the services more cost-effective. So I noted just the change in the last 10 years. There's been a 20 times increase in the capacity of the satellites. Satellite services start at $49 a month. So those are the two and three most important things that the industry has done. As I also noted, there are plans to launch additional LEO satellite systems. To give you a sense of that, there are approximately 1,700 satellites on orbit today. There are satellite applications that have either been granted or pending at the FCC for over 18,000 satellites. So the growth in the industry is tremendous. The capacity that will be available is increasing accordingly. And the thing that is most important to us is continued access to spectrum and technology neutrality. Without spectrum, we do not have the opportunity to grow, and we just want to make sure that neither Congress nor the FCC weights the scale against any one industry against the other.
Okay. Mr. Aiken?
Thank you for the question. You know, I think it's best illustrated with a story. You know, many farms across our great country are not connected to broadband, and this was the story of Lone Oaks Farm in Middleton, Tennessee, that didn't have any broadband connectivity to the farm. Along came Crossroads Wi-Fi, a fixed wireless provider who offered a robust business-grade broadband connection to that farm, using the spectrum band that I mentioned in my opening testimony, the CBRS band. And through that broadband connection, that 2,000-acre farm was on the short list to be considered by the University of Tennessee for purchase. The University of Tennessee purchased that farm, turned it into a 4-H state facility and a research institution. And that small local provider was able to grow the bandwidth with the university. And it's just a great story of how a small provider can provide big solutions to rural America.
I appreciate that, and that is a beautiful property. Mr. Forty, permitting issues are a struggle, and I would assume small providers are disproportionately impacted, but we hear about permitting issues regularly. But they talk about the burdensome application process. And I wish you would elaborate on that, and also the fact that the Senate now has a discussion draft that would streamline small cell deployments. And what we need to do is look at what more is needed to unleash this private capital to streamline this process and to make available more small cells that are like on the grain elevator at your location.
Well, thank you, Chairman Blackburn. Regarding the first part of your question, we have worked, very hard to continue to deploy broadband, and we have had some issues in some areas. Recently in North Dakota, we tried to run some fiber from the Killdeer area up to Watford City and to Williston. We had to hire several engineering firms and some difficult permitting issues crossing the Missouri River. So that's certainly one of the issues that we faced, and that project was delayed by several months that allowed service to get to those areas. Regarding the small cell, certainly, utilizing those areas in some of our more urban areas in our footprint in that legislation. But also, I don't know if that is the solution for some of our rural areas. We believe that the fixed wireless technology will be able to cover much greater distances between those elevators, between those farms, and the small cell will be good for some of our areas that are a little bit more urban, a little bit more populated. We want to make sure also that we have a level playing field there as a provider that those folks.
My time has expired, so I recognize Mr. Doyle for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Aiken, the Commission's currently considering changes to the license structure of the CBRS band. Based on your testimony, it sounds like many of your members had already started making investments in new technology based on how this band was to be structured. First, I'd like to ask you, do you think that if the Commission acts to expand the geographic size of the spectrum licenses, that your members and other rural providers will be able to successfully bid for those licenses?
The short answer there, Congressman, is no.
And what do you think will be lost if the licenses in these bands are made to be like traditional cellular licenses?
So this band it's absolutely critical to expand rural broadband. As you mentioned, a number of our members have already built out in the band. We polled our members; over 60% of them had made investments in reliance on the rules. And these are like I said in my testimony, these are small companies providing big service in rural America, and this would hamper their ability to reach new customers that are within range of their towers.
So basically, it's your opinion that expanded license size will actually hurt the deployment of broadband in rural areas?
I believe so, and we have a proposal before the FCC that's backed by a large number of rural providers that would retain some small area licenses that would enable our providers to participate in the auction.
I want to talk about the lower C-band, too. In the lower C-band, several satellite providers have proposed freeing up a portion of the band to be auctioned for mobile broadband license service. However, a broad array of stakeholders have proposed spectrum sharing rules in the rest of the band that would enable fixed wireless broadband. What are the merits of this proposal over the other proposals that would seek to transition the entire band to mobile broadband use? And to be honest, are these proposals even realistic?
So thank you for the question, Congressman. I think in this band, we have a fantastic opportunity to enable gigabit fixed wireless in rural America, and a way to do so consistent with everybody getting a win here. We are part of a much broader broadband access coalition that includes, again, a broad array of rural interests. And we put forth a proposal that would effectively clear some of the spectrum for 5G, would put some rational protections in place for satellite earth stations, and would make the remainder of the band available for licensed point-to-multipoint fixed wireless. And we believe this approach would have a significant impact on the availability of broadband in rural America.
Thank you. Ms. Corker-Craig, your testimony and the story of your community is very compelling, and apparently you have good barbecue down there, too, although Butterfield didn't share any of that with us. But we've had other people from communities that have provisioned their own broadband infrastructure here to testify before us, and it seems to me that every one of them seems to be happier with the service they provided themselves than any other available commercial option. Tell me what some of the advantages are of self-provisioning.
Well, it was amazing, the difference to be able to call if there was any problem or any problem with anything with the connection. To call and you talk with someone in Wilson who knew where Pine Tops was, and the speed and the reliability of their their services and technician were amazing. They know us. They're our friends and neighbors. We could usually get things fixed sometimes within a couple of hours. Sometimes they could do it over the phone, but if not, they would have a technician there sometimes in 30 minutes. and it was just a tremendous asset to a business. When you're operating a business, that time is money, and when you are having to wait for 2 and 3 days for a technician to come and fix your internet, it's well worth it to switch over to Greenlight.
Yeah. Well, Madam Chair, I see my time has almost expired, so I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And again, to our witnesses, thank you for being here. I thought I might put a photo up or two of Wallowa County just so you can enjoy the home view. And while we're working on that, Ms. Ward, when I learned that, so this is Chief Joseph, a statue. They do a lot of bronze work there. The Wallowas behind. And Chief Joseph Day is coming up weekend after next. So if you have anything, if you've got spare time, want to come out and enjoy Chief Joseph Day, so we'd be happy to host you. But you can see these photos of the wide open spaces, some of the farming community out there, and then another look with the Wallowas in the background. When I learned for the second year in a row, rural health care facilities like yours were facing a 25% cut in their requested funding under the Rural Health Care Program, I encouraged the FCC to take a close look at the program in order to help telehealth facilities pay for the cost of this connectivity. Talked to the chairman and his team. So I was really pleased in June when the FCC increased the funding for the rural health care program by $171 million a year, increasing the cap for the program to $571 million effective immediately. So it's a 43% increase in funding, represents what the funding level would have been today if the original $400 million cap that was established in 1997 had been adjusted for inflation. So if the additional funding had not been provided, what would these cuts have meant to Wallowa Memorial Hospital? From your perspective.
Thank you for the question. I think simply it would have been decreased access, increased travel time inconvenience for patients. It could, it's ones that aren't feeling well. Travel is difficult. Family members are often taking time away off work as well. And then increased cost to the patient and to the community to provide services that, or allow services out of town.
And in your testimony, you identified several barriers to expanding telehealth. You mentioned restrictions on Medicare reimbursements for remote patient monitoring, burdensome state licensing requirements, and the capital associated with developing and maintaining telehealth programs. Of these barriers, which do you think is most significant? What impacts you the most?
Because we are very patient-centered and patient-focused, I think the biggest barrier is the remote monitoring or access for those remote, whether it be a remote clinic, hospital, so that we can service the patients.
And are there additional barriers in the way the current rural health care program is formulated by the FCC? Anything there we need to be aware of?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
All right. And when you mentioned that the nearest critical access hospital after yours is 65 miles away, do you want to describe what that journey's like in the winter?
Well, if the roads are open, not bad snow and ice, it is a windy 2-lane highway. You're traveling with log trucks, potentially farm equipment, not so much in the winter probably, but 65 miles, but it takes over an hour to make the journey.
It's down a narrow, windy 2-lane road down into the river bottom and then up the canyons and out and around. It's tough territory. So if you lose service, if the fiber gets severed, what happens then?
You have no connections. You're relying on your own internal services within the county, within the cities, and that's not unusual. We've lost all connection. Your electronic health record goes down, your phone communication. We do drills around this. We're prepared for it because for us, it's a reality.
Mm-hmm. And talk to me about the interconnectivity among the other providers in the community there, the clinic, pharmacy, some of those things.
Sure. We're really very fortunate in Eastern Oregon and Wallowa County especially that we have separate clinics, we have our hospital, but we really function together. If you came from the outside, you would think it was one entity. Some of these specialists, they may be initially contracted with a non-hospital owned clinic, yet we can still use them for an inpatient in the hospital. The clinic will use services that we have set up in the hospital as well. Willow Valley Center for Wellness, Mental Health, and Behavioral Health has a great telemedicine program that benefits everyone as well.
All right. My time's about expired, Madam Chair. Thank you, and thanks again for making the journey. And
Chairman yields back, and Mr. Welch, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Butterfield has left, but I'll tell a story behind his back, but don't tell him. Shortly after he got elected to Congress, he thought he was kind of a big deal, like a lot of us, and he was back in Wilson, right next to Pine Top. And he went into a diner, and a number of women were there, and they knew him, and they looked at him, and they said, you know, that's pretty good, you got elected. Someday you may amount to something. You may be mayor of Wilson.
Good job.
And it's that hometown commitment, actually, that is so wonderful about a lot of your testimony. And Mr. Weldon, just the description in those pictures are very evocative for so many of us in our rural areas. And I just loved your testimony about how important it is to get that broadband there. Now, there's two things. Number one, I think, Madam Chair, it's a little premature for us to congratulate ourselves on what we've done for rural broadband because it kind of stinks in a lot of places. It really does. Number two, what Congress has to do first and foremost is we've got to dedicate funds to the build-out of broadband. There's just no escaping that. And it's just like what we made a decision in this country in the 30s about electricity. It wasn't... There was no economic case to be made for our utility companies to build out electricity in rural America. None. But we made a decision here, our predecessors did, that there was a social case to be made for it because rural America has the kind of people like you're describing, like Mr. Walden's describing, and we need them. So money is really going to be important, and I just have to say this, all of us who are dedicated to our rural constituencies, unless we're going to put some money in there, it's not going to go there. So that's number one. And then number two, how to do it, we've got to be flexible. And that's why I really enjoyed your testimony, Ms. Corker-Craig, because I live on a dirt road, 8-mile dirt road, and we've got great broadband. And it was local people who created a nonprofit. And I don't know how they managed to defy expectations, but they went up and down the roads and they got each of us to invest a little bit. And we get that kind of service that you're talking about. And so I want to start asking a few questions. I'll start with you, Mr. Aiken. If we get the money, and that's what we need, how do we deploy it in a way that's flexible? Because some of those pictures that I saw from Mr. Walden, we don't have those in Vermont. There's a lot of hills and valleys. We don't, and one size does not fit all. So how could we, if we had the money, deploy it in a way where we don't micromanage how to do it in Pine Top versus where Tennessee? You want to comment on that?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Congressman. You know, we represent predominantly small businesses. You know, we have a couple dozen providers who are participating in the upcoming Connect America Fund auction, but what I've heard from my members time and time again is that you know, complicated applications and you know, difficulty.
So how do we make it simple but accountable? Because I do think it's got to be done at a local level. Anybody else comment on that? I mean, you did it in Pine Top, right?
We did.
How'd you do it?
Well, like I said, we worked with the city of Wilson, and the only thing, we had that small window of time with the FCC ruling was the only way we were able to do it because the state legislature had said there would be no more expansion past the Wilson County line. So we were
Anybody else want to comment on that? How do we have accountability if we deploy money, but flexibility? So where a community's ready to go and they've got whatever it takes, we can get them going. You want?
So I can take a stab at that, Congressman. So I think, you know, accountability on the back end is important. I think we're comfortable with a reverse auction design like that that's included in the Lift America Act, and you know, we think that a streamlined but accountable application is important, and that's one of the reasons why we think the principles in the Broadband Access Act are so important.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Ward? I'm going to yield back. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I will say we put $670 million in the Omni, RUS, for deployment and $171 million at the FCC for rural health care. Mr. Lance, you're recognized. 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. That brings me to my questions regarding the additional funding that we put into RUS for a new loan and grant program for rural broadband. To Mr. Forty and Mr. Aiken, from your perspective in rural America, what is the best way this funding could be deployed in order to reach the most Americans in need with the amount of resources that the government has placed in that program?
Well, certainly, focusing on those truly areas that are truly unserved, to make sure that we take care of them first, I think is very important, and obviously being technology neutral. We of course have our fiber networks. We deliver gig through high-frequency cable, and then we use the fixed wireless tools to reach the last mile. So having all those things work, and I think there are some unique broadband grant programs out there. The state of Minnesota has a program where you get more points if you put more private capital into it. There is a challenge process to make sure that there's no overbuilding taking place, and a lot of unique things with that program that we work with that really help to find those areas that are truly unserved that need it most, and we're not spending too many federal dollars on those.
Do you know, do other states intend to proceed the way Minnesota has proceeded, as you have outlined it?
Not currently in our Midco footprint. Kansas, I believe, has looked at it a little bit, but they're in the initial stages of that process.
Thank you. Mr. Aiken.
Yes, I would echo what Mr. Forty said, that a focus on unserved areas is critical. Ensuring that private capital isn't overbuilt by government subsidies is also critical. And we also believe that there should be a focus on cost effectiveness in the program. We have a limited number of dollars, we have a lot of people to serve, and we need that money to go as far as possible.
There is, of course, a difference between underserved and unserved. Mr. Aiken, from your expertise, how many Americans are completely unserved?
So the number is smaller than those that are underserved. I think the FCC counts 24 million as not having access to advanced telecommunications capability. That number includes folks who have access to less than 25/3 broadband. But our members are focused on providing that high-speed service that rural Americans need.
Thank you. Would anyone else on the panel like to comment?
Yes, I'd like to.
Yes, of course.
I'd like to emphasize that last year alone, 2 of our member companies, Viasat and EchoStar, launched satellites with the advanced technologies that I talked about with 25/3 FCC-defined broadband speeds. Both of those companies have announced plans for their next satellites, and I talked earlier about the LEO systems that have been announced. So our members are not looking for subsidies in order to provide these services. They're moving forward with launching this capacity, and certainly, as I noted earlier in my testimony, provide coverage across the entire country. So certainly the industry is moving forward with launching additional capacity to provide service to all areas of the country without any subsidies.
Yes, thank you. I live in a state, New Jersey, that is the most densely populated in the nation, and we are well served by and large, but I want to assure the panel that I will continue to work on this issue as the sponsor of one of the pieces of legislation that is important for this area. And to those from the great state of Tennessee, my wife and I met in law school at Vanderbilt, and I have a great affection for your wonderful state, not only because the chairman is from that state, but also from personal experience. I yield back a minute, Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Loebsack, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do first want to thank the chair and the ranking member for holding this important meeting today. And It's been great testimony, and thanks to all of you on the panel today for your testimony and for answering the questions. It's clearly no secret to those of us on the committee here that I do like to talk about rural broadband from Iowa. I've got about 24 I have 24 counties in Iowa. It's not quite a fourth of the state geographically, but it's quite a bit. And then how to build out capacity in Iowa and the rest of rural America. At one point, the chair even called me broadband lobesack, and that's a flag that I'm very happy to fly while I'm on this committee, while I'm in the Congress. And in my district, as many of you know, farming is a huge part of the economy, and I thank Mr. May and John Deere for all the great work that those folks do with respect to the farming community in Iowa and around the country, and indeed around the world for John Deere. And farmers across America are facing a lot of challenges right now. We don't need to talk about trade, but there are a lot of things that are facing these farmers right now, a lot of challenges. And it makes it more important than ever that I think for our communities in the rural areas and the agricultural communities to be as efficient and productive as possible. And to help lend our farmers a hand, I joined with Representative Latta in introducing the Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act, and I really appreciate the fact that that you folks were behind that, obviously, Mr. May. And that bill, as was stated, would, as you know, would create a task force to help the FCC figure out how to deploy broadband on agricultural land to promote more precise farming techniques. And Mr. May, I'd just like to ask you from your company's perspective, you did mention this already a little bit, but what would having robust broad access mean to so many of your customers who really need precise and efficient farming equipment? What does this technology mean for agricultural productivity as well?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Maybe I'll give you a couple examples of products that will unlock a lot of productivity and frankly, more sustainability within agriculture. Number one, I'll go back to the 60s and where we saw a 3 times increase in productivity because of technology introduced at that time. That journey continues. Today, what's driving that journey is access to machines in the farm, on the farm field. For example, we have the ability today to stream computer-generated prescriptions directly to a planter based on the field conditions in that field and have the planter plant in the most optimal way. When the farmer's in combining, picking the corn in the field, we're sensing the environment that combine's in and connecting back to the cloud to stream recommendations on how to optimize that combine based on exactly what it's sensing within that field. We also, when we have a machine go down, you know what that means to a farmer. When that machine stops, it's dollars flowing out the window of the cab, and we need to get the machine up fast. With internet connection, we can connect remotely directly to that machine and diagnose the problem that's happening and get them back up and running quickly. So we believe this phase of internet-based agriculture is going to unlock tremendous value in productivity and sustainability.
Right. And feed America and feed the world, for
Absolutely.
that matter, too. Yeah, and just briefly, last September, I went to visit a farmer in one part of my district, and I got there, and he was getting the corn in, and I knew how important that time was to him. So I said, listen, we don't have to go in your house for an hour and talk about the issues. Do you mind if I get in the cab with you? And that's what we did to bring the harvest in, and he was talking to me about the technology. It was really quite amazing. But this particular bill, and I'm proud to, I've worked with Congressman Ladd on that. We've got to make sure that we have the information so that these machines can operate as effectively as possible. Are there any other things you'd like to add that we could be doing along those lines?
First of all, thank you for your work on that. We believe that that'll bring a significant amount of value to agriculture across the United States. I think one of the other things that could be helpful is maybe a joint study between the FCC and the USDA to truly understand where do we have the issues, where it's unserved, as was mentioned, and underserved, so that we can attack these problem areas directly.
And that's connected to my other question, actually, too. And I'm probably going to just have to ask this question for the record of you, Mr. Aiken, but it has to do with mapping, obviously, and I'm very happy that we did get my mapping bill through. But I do have a letter, Madam Chair, from Sheraton Valley Electric Cooperative, if I could put that in the record with unanimous.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. And then I'll just submit a question to you, Mr. Aiken, for the record, and I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yells back, and next week he'll have the opportunity to ask the FCC about doing that study, and I'm sure he will. Mr. Latta, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks very much for having this hearing today. It's very, very needed. I represent the largest farm income producing district in the state of Ohio, and it's important to our agriculture producers out here to have this technology. And I've served and serve as the co-chair of the Rural Broadband Caucus and also co-chair of the Rural Telecommunications Working Group. And, we believe that it's absolutely important that we get the broadband out to our rural areas of our country. And it's not on the ag side, but from the testimony we've heard from the other witnesses. If you can't operate a business, you can't operate a hospital, you can't do certain things out there if you don't have that technology. So it's absolutely important that we have that. A little bit different from my area is a little bit different from the chairman of the full committee, where you saw the mountains in the background. If you look at my district, it's probably as flat as your table that you're sitting at, but we grow things, and we're very productive there. But if I could ask my first question, Mr. May, does it matter to you what type of technology is used to deliver that broadband service to connect agriculture producers, customers, and vendors across America, as long as the service is safe, affordable, and effective at meeting the needs of those users?
There's lots of technologies that can be applied to make agriculture more productive, and frankly, we think each one of them has a place, and we're open to all of them. Whether you talk guidance, GPS systems using satellite-based networks to guide vehicles in the field within centimeters, that plays a critical role. Internet connections and the ability to stream large quantities of data is also significant. So for us, we think there are several technologies that can be leveraged within agriculture, but certainly internet connectivity is critical from the data side of agriculture.
Well, what you say about, especially on the GPS and being able to be within centimeters, that about 2 years ago I was out in the southwest part of my district, and what we were doing at that time, they were showing how, my mom grew up on a farm. My grandfather used horses back in the 30s. My wife's, I saw in your testimony that deer's been around now for 181 years. My wife's family's been on the same farm in Northwest Ohio for 185 years. And but that day that we were out, they were putting in fertilizer and furrows to keep from having runoff or anything like that. But in the spring, when they were going to go out and plant that corn, they were going to be able to put it within an inch of where that furrow was. So that's what that technology does. So we appreciate that. Mr. Strupp and Mr. Ford, if I can ask you, will both of you provide examples of how your industries are working to promote rural broadband for precision agriculture? And what are some of those broadband solutions?
I'd like to start by noting that precision begins with GPS, as you noted, and it's important to recognize that GPS is provided via satellite. Also, precision agriculture involves Earth observation from weather information, which is gathered via satellite, and the ability to take the imagery and refresh it on a daily basis, all one of the capabilities of the satellite industry. But to get to the communications aspect of it, the addition of the capacity that we've been talking about is an important aspect of what the satellite industry is doing. That, in combination with flat panel antenna technology, which provides the ability to build it into every tractor, combine, and provide continuous connectivity, because ultimately one of the great advantages of the satellite industry is ubiquitous coverage. So we have complete coverage of rural America, and the important thing that we're doing in terms of the capacity is adding additional satellites and the high technology that we've talked about.
Thank you. Ms. Ford, I've got about 49 seconds if you can answer that.
Absolutely. One of the greatest examples is we have a small group of elevators, and the farmers in that region are now able to use Midco fiber running to some of those elevators and connecting that group of elevators through fixed wireless technology, so the farmers are able to tell and direct their trucks when they're dumping off their grain and instantly be able to see where their grain was going in and being able to see those records immediately online. So I think that tool's been great for that group of elevators and the farmers in the area to make sure they know how much grain was going and how much was was unloaded. Additionally, we have grain dryers. Of course, drying corn takes a tremendous amount of stuff, and you have folks and farmers that are monitoring grain dryers, 24, almost 24 hours a day to keep those things running. Well, fixed wireless technology allows them to do some of that from their easy chair in their homes and spend more time with their families.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. My time has expired.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. McNerney, you're recognized.
Well, I thank the chairwoman and I thank the panelists. Ms. Craig, the state and local governments in California are doing important work right now with private industry to build out broadband in the state, and I believe our state is leading the nation when it comes to forward-leading policies in this area. But I'm worried about calls to preempt state and local government in the name of streamlining wireless siting policies. In fact, California just rejected such a proposal on the state level. What we need, I believe, instead is industry and cities working together to meet individual constituents' needs like what just happened in San Jose. Do you think the federal streamlining of local government siting policy will make meaningful progress toward bringing high-speed fiber to unserved and underserved areas?
Well, I think if that streamlining would give us the flexibility in local areas to work with our partners. And like I said, our partnership with Wilson was well established. So to me, it was a natural partnership. We trusted them. We knew that they were being fiscally responsible with this network. So if that streamlining would simplify and give us the flexibility that we need, because rural areas are very unique. Some things may work for one area, but not in another.
That's the point, isn't it? That you don't want a uniform federal policy that preempts local state policies in some name of streamlining.
Right, but we also need to get past those barriers that we had in our response was a state government.
Well, thanks. Rather than fighting against local governments, I think local governments and industry could work together to find meaningful solutions. The Broadband Finance Investment and Innovation Act that Congressman Lujan introduced, and I'm a co-sponsor of, would help public-private partnerships gain access to capital for deploying high-speed broadband. I think it could make a real difference in districts like mine and others. Do you think the use of PPPs, as this legislation envisions, would allow federal government to work constructively with local governments?
It sounds like it would. I'm not terribly well versed on that legislation, but it sounds like it would.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. May, for some time now, I've been raising concerns about cybersecurity and internet-connected devices. The Lift America Act, which I'm a co-sponsor, would acknowledge these concerns by requiring that all broadband projects funded by the Act would have to work to meet network security specifications. What might cybersecurity vulnerabilities mean to farmers who are using advanced agricultural technology?
Farmers today that are utilizing these advanced technologies are streaming large quantities of data, not only to their own farm, but to their trusted advisors to help them make better decisions. John Deere's been very transparent in our role to make sure that that data is as secure as possible, it's accessible, and it's easy to share. We've also tried to work with farm bureaus to develop more standards around what sort of security protocols should be in place. And we believe that the security of data is critical, and we support continuing to invest in that.
Well, what risks do farmers have, the ones that are actually using the technology?
The risk the farmer could have is if their data gets in the hands of somebody they didn't intend it to. So if their yield data or how they planted the fields, what seed they used, that's their IP. Oh. And if that got in the hands of, I planted this hybrid, I sprayed with this sort of application, and I created a yield 10% higher than you, that's IP. And if that were to get in the hands of somebody else, then it's a loss to the farmer.
Thank you. Ms. Ward, in your testimony, you point out that fewer than 50% of households in the bottom income quintile use internet at home, and that narrowing this divide would become even more important as health care moves to a value-based system. Can you expand in your testimony and talk about the health implications if lower income middle Americans are unable to afford access to broadband at home?
Sure, thank you for the question. Those patients with that lower socioeconomic status are often some of the less healthy patients, or they don't access health care as frequently. So there are ways that we could do in-home monitoring, whether it's video, phone, email monitoring of their health conditions that would prevent readmissions maybe to the hospital, improve their health, get them regular visits with their doctor when maybe they can't afford to even drive in to the clinic.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Guthrie, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for holding this meeting. I'd like to start by thanking my co-chair from California, Doris Matsui. We've worked on the Spectrum Caucus together. It seems like every meeting we have here, we talk about spectrum, but it's so important. And I just want to point out in the Rayburn Act, there was also just nuances of technology policy. It's amazing. We had actually put in there the Spectrum Auction Deposits Act, just so they could deposit bank deposits for selling of spectrum. That was asked for by Chairman Pai. And the chairwoman was great to work with us and have this in the mark so that we can move forward, and appreciate you doing that. I'm also pleased with the Commission's work on mid-band, licensed and unlicensed bands that can help us keep the U.S. on the cutting edge of 5G rather than letting China or any other person try to beat us to that. So, Mr. Forte, and also Mr. Aiken, I might ask you to comment. The question for Mr. Forte, but if you would comment. Starting with the spectrum question, I know that you're trying to provide service for unserved areas by using fixed wireless technology, and you say in your testimony that you need access to more spectrum in order to accomplish that. Charter is doing similar things in Kentucky. So thanks for your efforts, and for Mr. Forte and Mr. Aiken, how much spectrum do you think is needed for fixed wireless, and what will be the results for consumers, and what can we do on this front? What more can we do on this front? Start with Mr. Forte and then Mr. Aiken.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, access to more spectrum, most importantly, the type of spectrum that works best for our customers and our people in rural areas. We need to make sure that the spectrum that is offered, provides interference, protection out there. I know the C-band has been talked a little bit about today, but we are, of course, an existing cable television provider, and we use that C-band to provide television service to tens of thousands of customers across all the states that we serve, and that's the only option that we have. So if we were to look at that band for fixed wireless, we need to make sure that that is also protected. And one of the bands that isn't being used as much in our area is the 2.5, the educational broadband. And one of the reasons we really like that spectrum is because it's able to go penetrate dense forests, tree lines, things like that, and get through those obstacles. And obviously, it does have a certain educational benefit. I mean, I live in a very rural area. My kids go to a school out in the country 5 miles from my house, and I'm amazed even at their young age how much work that is destined on having that good, reliable internet connection. So yeah, I think we need more spectrum in all these areas to accomplish the project, accomplish it, but let's make sure it works for everybody.
Thank you. Mr. Aiken?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. Yeah, I would echo what Mr. Forte said. We're looking at a lot of mid-band spectrum, so the same sort of spectrum bands that Mr. Forte mentioned, the EBS spectrum at 2.5 gigahertz, the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, the CBRS band, which the FCC is currently considering, as well as the 3.7 to 4.2. Spectrum band. That mid-band spectrum has great characteristics to be able to go a long ways and carry a significant amount of bandwidth, which is perfect for radios that have to go many miles to houses in rural America.
Thanks. Another concern, and I have a district that could be a little bit of, Bob Latta just said his is flat as a table, some of the best farmland in the country, and I have some that doesn't have the mountains quite that my friend from Oregon has, but beautiful mountains and lakes. And Mammoth Cave, anybody wants to visit, is there as well. So it's a beautiful place, but it is rural and also is suburban and urban. I live in Bowling Green, which is kind of a boom, tied in with the work our chairwoman's done in Middle Tennessee to make that area such a boom town. We're kind of tied in with that. I'm an hour from Nashville. And if you look at mapping, that's what I'm talking about. If you look at you would say Bowling Green is covered with broadband. And we have some friends from mine here from Connected Nation, who's a local hometown group who does the mapping. But it depends on where you live. Even I have very rural counties that that is exactly what we're talking about. But even where I live, and some people won't develop, they can't move forward because people don't want to buy a home that doesn't have broadband access moving forward. So just in mapping, getting more specific in mapping, I think we were talking about, it's just too broad to say that one county is covered or not. So my question is for the panel, and I didn't leave you much time, but what recommendations do you have to improve the granularity and accuracy of the data collected? And what recommendations do you have to improve it? And should NTIA coordinate with the commission, or are there other ideas by giving it to NTIA solely? Anybody? I only got a few seconds, so one of you want to hit that? Just making mapping better.
Yeah, certainly I would start with ensuring that the information is up to date. We've recognized that given the advances in the satellite industry, the fact that we do provide 25/3 coverage is not included in the current map. And one other technology that I would acknowledge that I think will be useful in terms of the broadband mapping is technology that's being deployed that allows for RF mapping from space. And ultimately, I would recommend that company's technology, they're launching their first 3 satellites this year, be considered to be able to identify where there is actually a signal rather than just identification of hopes that there is a signal.
Thank you. And I'm out of time. I yield back.
Ms. Matsui, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. We talked about spectrum is absolutely necessary to meet the coverage requirements of rural broadband networks. In 2004, Congress created the Spectrum Relocation Fund to assist federal agencies relocating or sharing spectrum for wireless broadband use. And in 2015, Congress made improvements to the SRF by allowing agencies to use SRF funds for engineering research and development. But current law limits how much of these funds can be used by agencies to perform the research and related activities necessary to potentially reallocate, or share their spectrum. And last month, my spectrum partner, Congressman Guthrie, and I, along with Senators Wicker and Schatz, introduced the Spectrum Now Act to fix this problem. Specifically, the framework in Spectrum Now Act could provide a pathway for NTIA and DoD to make additional 100 megawatts of spectrum available in the 3.4 gigahertz band. Mr. Aiken, what potential does a 3.4 gigahertz band have for WISP networks, and how could the Spectrum Now Act help meet the growing demand on wireless networks across rural America?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. We're incredibly supportive of that legislation, and it could make a real difference in rural broadband, particularly if the FCC gets the rules right on the 3.5 gigahertz or CBRS rulemaking, because that would allow these fixed wireless radios to just simply have a software upgrade and be able to utilize the spectrum in that band as well.
Right. Okay, thank you. Narrowband IoT networks are particularly useful for long-range, low-power applications. Specifically, these networks improve capacity, spectrum efficiency, and power consumption levels of user devices. Narrowband IoT networks have potential both nationwide and particularly for rural coverage. These networks can coexist with commercial mobile networks, and their propagation characteristics provide better range and reduce coverage costs for consumers in both rural areas and across the country. The entire panel, what potential benefits do narrowband IoT networks have in rural areas from a spectrum, efficiency, cost, and deployment perspective? Mr. Stroop, would you like to start?
Certainly, I think as you noted, narrowband signals are more spectrum efficient, and you can put them in smaller allocations. Companies like Iridium, which is a satellite-based company, has been providing IoT services in rural America for some time. So those services are already deployed. They tend to be more cost-effective just because they do not have the same power requirements either that broadband systems do.
Thank you. Mr. Ford?
We'd be happy to get back to you on that.
Oh, certainly. Mr. Aiken?
Sure. So we generally view those networks as incredibly complementary to fixed wireless networks. It enables a lot of connectivity on farms that have a lot of benefit to precision agriculture efforts, and we view those networks as complementary, and we see our customers of our members who are farmers utilize both.
Okay, fine. Mr. May.
That technology, we believe, will play a role in machine-to-machine communication, but very limited capability if you have to upload data to the cloud. So where we're sharing maps within a field between two planners, it makes a lot of sense. But if we need to transfer data to or from that machine, it has limited capability.
Okay, fine.
I will claim a little bit of ignorance being a healthcare practitioner, not as much on the technology side, but I can say with our diverse terrain in our county, I think we take advantage of just about every opportunity that's out there. Certain technologies are going to work better in different areas.
Absolutely.
I'll also claim ignorance in this proudly, but it sounds to me like it's just another option and it points again to the flexibility that small communities need to have in working with whatever tools they can get.
Okay. I don't have much time, but I want to ask the question on the C-band about the particular clearing mechanism that could be used to allow additional terrestrial use in the 3.7, 4.2 gigahertz band. In particular, NRPM sought comment on whether a market-based or auction approach could be utilized to clear the spectrum that could then be made available for terrestrial mobile use. Mr. Stroop, I'm interested on how a voluntary market-based mechanism would function for the various services currently being utilized in the C-band.
I think one of the most important things to keep in mind with respect to the C-band is just how heavily used it is. As part of the NOI process that the FCC went through, there were a number of users that came forward, and there are thousands of earth stations serving over 120 million people for video distribution services. So ultimately, if the FCC does decide that they're going to make any of that spectrum available, a market-based approach where they have an opportunity to work with the customer base, meaning the satellite companies have an opportunity to work with the existing customer base, is more likely to achieve the goals in the short term.
Thank you very much, and I've run out of time. Thank you very much.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Olson, you're recognized.
I thank the chair and welcome to our 6 witnesses. Not to mislead y'all, Texas 22 is 2/3 the suburbs of Houston, Texas, and 1/3 rural. That means corn, milo, cotton, and cattle. Our smallest farms and ranches are doing just fine. They have the broadband access that Greater Houston has, but that access can disappear in a few hours in a natural disaster, like Hurricane Harvey. We learned a lot from Hurricane Ike that hit us in 2008. We buried our lines deep in the soil, so that stayed up a lot. We still lost some connectivity during the storm. And as you know, the most precious, life-saving commodity in a disaster is information. We found out, too, our process for permits needs to be streamlined to provide that lifeline. And that's why I introduced H.R. 4845, called the Connecting Communities Post-Disasters Act. This legislation allows federal disaster areas to be exempt from the National Environmental Policy Act and the Historical Preservation Act. That just lets communities get going quickly to rebuild. And Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to introduce 2 letters of support for my legislation, one from the NTIA and one from the WIA.
Without objection.
Mr. Straub, question for you, sir. And also, what are your main considerations from your perspective in the industry that federal agencies can streamline disaster requirements and just streamline process for permits overall, especially in disaster? Any advice for the federal government to act so we don't have the problems we had with Hurricane Harvey?
Well, certainly the satellite industry provides important capability in hurricane and natural disaster events because we have our infrastructure in the sky. From a permitting perspective, just the opportunity to be able to get our earth stations located if they're not already in place and work with existing customers like the cellular industry in order to be able to get their portable systems up and running. So our infrastructure is there. We don't need permitting with respect to that. It's the earth stations that where we can benefit from a streamlined process.
As a side note, DirecTV dish in our home was basically a weather radar. It went out on the TV. Guess what was going to hit us in about 10 minutes? a big, nasty thunderstorm. So thank you for that. My next question is for you, Mr. May. I saw the third generation of agricultural revolution in northwest Fort Bend County a few years ago. The farmer was not a farmer. He was, I call, a manager of farm technology. He had this massive, huge John Deere tractor, big self-contained cockpit, air conditioning, had a little radio, satellite radio. The tractor was driving itself. What made that so special is he was putting every seed down perfectly, the same distance apart, the same depth, making all the turns, and so that's exciting. You talked about also 4G. You discussed the fourth agricultural revolution, which uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to allow farmers to be more productive, be better farmers. Can you discuss the benefits of AI in the agriculture sector?
Absolutely. We're really excited. We call this the fourth generation, if you will, of farming. And the new technologies that are available to us are going to bring, the way I like to describe it is today that farmer still relies heavily on his eyes for vision to see what's happening in the field. He relies on the 30 years of knowledge he has in his head, and then he makes adjustments with his fingers on the computer to optimize the machine. Computer vision, artificial intelligence, and robotics are going to help make that farmer even more better. We recently acquired a company called Blue River that's focused on eliminating up to 90% of chemicals that are used in field by only spraying the weeds that are located within the fields. So it's a huge advantage to productivity and, more importantly, sustainability.
Thank you. 18 seconds left, so I'd like to offer my help to you, Mrs. Coker Craig. The whole town of Pine Tops, North Carolina. My dear friend, Mr. Butterfield, talked about having barbecue at Abrams. With all due respect, ma'am, you want the best barbecue in America? That's in Texas. Texas barbecue. I offer you to come to either Killins in Pearland, Texas, or the Swinging Door in Fort Bend County. Have the best barbecue in America. I yield back.
Well, and I'll challenge that. Anybody ever heard of Memphis and the barbecue competition? All right, Ms. Eshoo, 5 minutes.
Well, I can't recommend a barbecue in Silicon Valley, but thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for having this. This is a very important hearing. When at least a third of our country is either underserved or not served in the second decade of the 21st century, that's a major issue for our country. Our founding fathers knew that to be a united country, that Americans needed a nationwide communication system. And so this is a very important responsibility that we have. I want to thank the witnesses. Each one of you, I think, have been excellent. And you've touched on, in a deep and broad way, either what your association members are doing, what your companies are doing, what's happening in healthcare, and what's happening in municipalities. I want to thank the chairwoman for, in her opening statement, making a positive comment about the Dig Once policy that was in the Rayburn legislation. It is sensible, dig once. I don't know why no one ever thought of it before we did it. I guess it was, as my grandmother used to say, the most uncommon of the senses is common sense. But at any rate, we got that one done. Now, at the same time, she was critical of the Community Broadband Act and that it undermines state legislatures. Now, I very purposefully introduced that legislation because I think it's important to examine what is standing in the way. Why are we not making headway, especially in rural areas? And I have that too in my district. Imagine, in Silicon Valley, there are people that are either underserved or have no service whatsoever. I think most people would be stunned to realize that. There are today about 20 states that have outright prohibitions or bans relative to municipal broadband. Now, I think that these state legislatures are undermining local municipalities from coming up with their own solutions. I come from local government, like you, Ms. Craig, and I really have a reverence for local government. I prefer a bottom-up than a top-down in many cases. Now, there are some cases where I believe a national umbrella is very important relative to federal policy for our country. I want to ask you, Ms. Craig, why do you think anyone would do that? Now, is it because it's been, it's been proven to be effective? Cities like Chattanooga and Wilson were stopped from deploying high-speed broadband access to people who want it. Now, there's a whole variety of reasons that we can stitch together why we are where we are, 1/3 of the country. But who did this in your state?
Well, the primary
Who are the interests? Who are the interests that went to the state legislature to make sure that this access was banned?
My understanding is it was the big telecom industry.
You got it.
It was the large.
Now that's my softball or hardball question to you. So I think we need to put the facts on the table, and that is that the very large interests, very large money hold sway. And this is holding back local communities from creating a choice. In most cases, it's much cheaper, too. So that's what's happening in the country. So, if people want to stand with their state legislature for especially screwing their local communities, so be it. But that's what's happening. That's what's happening. And that's a very big thing in our country, especially because 1/3 of the country is not getting what they need. I want to ask the panel, I don't have enough time, so I'll put that question to the full panel. Your single one best idea on how we can advance. I'll put that in writing and look forward to your response. Thank you for being here today. I think you're all part of the solution. And again, I thank the chairwoman for having this hearing.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thanks to our panel for joining us today. I represent a very rural part of the country, the entire eastern flank of the state of Ohio, all along the Ohio River. Broadband access is one of my top priorities. We must figure this out. A one-size solution doesn't work everywhere in the country. And the digital-rural divide is very, very real. We are losing a tremendous amount of intellectual capital, from young people to entrepreneurs to you name it, kids that can't do their homework, businesses that won't come into a rural area because they can't get access to the internet to connect with their customers, their suppliers, manage their employees. There's a host of reasons why this is a somewhat of an urgent, I would even say in many cases, desperate situation for economic development. And some people think that it's a pie-in-the-sky luxury to have access to high-speed internet, and that is simply not true. In a digitized world that we live in today, where we do business across the oceans like we used to do business across town, you got to have access to the internet. And I think that starts with being able to accurately identify those areas that are unserved and underserved. And that's been a complicated and yet inadequate effort up until now. And that's why I was glad to introduce the Mapping Now Act, reasserting NTIA's authority to go do this. And I'm also pleased that the discussion draft to reauthorize NTIA tasked the administration with facilitating more accurate, granular maps of broadband coverage so that we can get on with this process. So, Mr. Aiken and Mr. Stroop, Administrator Riedel recently stated in his testimony before the Senate Commerce Committee that, and I quote, NTIA has long been a leader in gathering and analyzing broadband adoption and data, and on May 30th, 2018, NTIA published a request for comment to determine the most efficient path forward. So, gentlemen, could you offer your thoughts as to what NTIA should consider when thinking about how to get the most accurate and reliable data to properly inform broadband investment decisions? Because I don't think it's rocket science, and I'm really frustrated with the length of time and the lack of progress. So, Mr. Aiken, let's go with you first, then we'll come down to Mr. Stroop.
Sure, thank you, Congressman. And we're actively engaged with NTIA on its rulemaking on mapping efforts, and appreciate their work on this issue. You know, we share the frustration at the lack of good data out there on broadband deployment. It means that folks who might be eligible for the Connect America Fund aren't. And there are a host of other problems that you accurately identified. One of the things that we think we can potentially do is move, particularly for a fixed wireless perspective, to a polygon method of characterizing deployment. That's something that we think we can do without unduly burdening our smallest members. As you know, our association is made up of mom and pop companies, so regulatory burden is a pretty significant concern. But we're actively working towards finding solutions that will work both for our members and for the data needs of our country.
Mr. Stroop.
We also have engaged with NTIA and encouraged them to take advantage or to reflect the most up-to-date capabilities, as I noted with respect to the satellite industry, the 25.3 capabilities, and also the point that I had made earlier about utilizing new technologies to be able to do RF mapping, to be able to determine where there is, in fact, a signal.
Sure. Well, like I said, I don't think it's rocket science, but guess what? Even if it is rocket science, we got rocket science in this country. We ought to be able to figure this out, and it ought not to be this dadgum complicated. But with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Brooks, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you so much for holding this really important hearing, and thank you all. I'm sorry some of us have been going back and forth between other hearings, but this is critically important. I represent Indianapolis, suburbs, and rural communities in central Indiana, and not too long ago I had the opportunity with FCC Chair, one of the members of the committee, Carr, to visit Beck's Hybrids, and saw something that was really quite amazing. And so I guess Mr. Aiken and maybe Mr. May, they have what they call Farm Server, where they have created their own server and service to help with precision ag, and it's simplified, but it allows their clients, not just their own customers, but others who are participating in FarmServe, to generate reports such as yield by soil type, yield by hybrid, yield by prescription. It is seed selection streamlined, field-focused record keeping, full support, taking information from a farm office out into the field very precisely, but then aggregating all of this data. And they had this massive server system, data storage that up in northern Hamilton County, and I was not aware they were doing something of this level of sophistication, although they're incredibly tech-savvy company and always have been, but I am concerned about we talked about data security, and that's not what I'm going to go into, but their customers and those who they are working with, I asked about whether or not 5G, which is now being implemented in Indianapolis and some of the surrounding areas, you mentioned 4G, that is what Mr. May made me think about 5G. This type of service could have I think, a dramatic impact on the ag industry. They used a WISP called OnRamp. And so can you all talk with us, is this happening anywhere else in the country, or are they truly unique in the country? And I'm just curious, Reynolds Farm Equipment, a great John dealer is right down the road from them. Can you all talk about this a little bit, Mr. Aiken, maybe? And you may or may not know about this, Mr. May, and 5G. Yes.
Sure. So thank you, Congresswoman, and really appreciate you going out to visit our member, OnRamp Indiana, and see the work that they are doing as a really small company, but bringing big connectivity and enabling the kind of innovations that you just mentioned in your statement. And I think this is it's indicative of what our members are doing across the country. A lot of our members are actually farmers in addition to being broadband providers, so they understand what farms need in order to be able to be successful both in the broadband world and in the farming world. But as far as 5G is concerned, I think we have to remember when we talk about 5G that 5G is not only mobile. 5G is also fixed wireless, right. And a lot of the same technical innovations that we see going into the mobile space also will be in the fixed space. So, our members, if we have adequate access to spectrum, can provide these gigabit or multi-gigabit speeds to farms who desperately need the connectivity for big data.
Mr. May, anything you'd like to talk about 5G?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, 5G would bring, additional capability in streaming larger sets of data. But today we have a similar system. It's the John Deere Operations Center, where a John Deere farmer today is streaming on a real-time basis from the field directly to our cloud-based ecosystem all of their agronomic data that then they can share with any of their trusted advisors in order to make better decisions and stream it directly back to the machine in the field. So as we advance the internet connectivity, that's only going to unlock more value within the field.
Are there many companies like John Deere and Beck's doing this across the country, or is it really just the largest? And the other thing I want to mention is so many of these companies are also near small towns. We often think of urban and rural, but small towns like Pine Top and others, do we think we are going to get 5G to small town, to Pine Top, North Carolina? I mean, what are we going to do because I think we're going to be jumping to 5G very fast.
Yeah, our system's a global system that extends across the globe that uses multiple different internet capabilities. 5G, frankly, is a luxury from a data transmission standpoint, but we're leveraging today 3G and 4G as well to do the same thing.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your testimony. Really appreciate all your work. I yield back.
Yields back. Mr. Bilirakis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it very much. Thank the panel for their testimony. One of the most important topics of discussion as we continue to build new connections, upgrade systems, and resiliency. We saw what happened, of course, in Florida, Texas, and Puerto Rico. Now we're in hurricane season, 2018 hurricane season. Similarly, other parts of the nation face their own natural disasters, not just hurricanes. They face the threats that can impact connectivity and slow emergency communications. Mr. Forte, as MidCo continues to expand to unserved markets, as well as upgrade existing systems, what precautions are being taken to help ensure that these systems are resilient to natural disasters, which for your area would be tornado threats, of course?
The first thing is obviously we build a lot of redundancy into our system. Multiple fiber rings of sizes large and small allow that technology to go back around the ring. So if we do have a fiber cut or an instance, that instantly reroutes and is the first step in keeping up for lost service. Additionally, we have had some disasters in North Dakota and tornadoes and flooding, and we've responded with providing free Wi-Fi and things for those communities on an instant basis. We have some trailers and things that we do. They're our friends, they're our customers. We do the best we can to make sure their communications are always working and up and running as fast as possible. And if for some reason the main lines aren't working, we provide alternate forms of technology to get them up and running right away.
Thank you. Continuing on the topic of natural disasters, Mr. Stroop, in your written testimony, you stated that satellite technology can deploy temporary fixed installations and very small aperture terminal antennas in the aftermath of a disaster to help communities get reconnected. And the question is, how long does it take to deploy these systems to an impacted area? And what actions need to be taken by consumers in order to use these temporary systems if they do not have a pre-existing relationship with that satellite provider?
The systems can be deployed in a matter of hours, depending upon where the equipment is located. I think what happened in Puerto Rico is a good example where carriers have come forward and noted that satellite needs to be considered an important part of the infrastructure for the rebuilding process because of the speed and capability of the industry. For consumers, very often it is a matter of going to a point where there is a satellite connection. And a good example is in Puerto Rico, where people lined up at a grocery store to be able to use satellite technology. So it's something that very often is used in conjunction with cellular systems. So they are providing the backhaul where the cellular system has gone down with other technologies, point-to-point technologies. It's not necessarily as applicable in terms of providing the point-to-point technology, but more being able to provide the backhaul capability.
Okay, very good. I appreciate it very much. And I'll yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Kramer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all of you. My goodness, I'm sitting here, as you know, I've sat here the whole time, and I've loved every minute of it because I see solutions. I have to agree with Ms. Eshu. She said, you look at the six of you and you find the solution to the problem. I was thinking about the Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act, and what would that task force that the FCC will set up should we pass this bill look like? I think it looks a lot like this, quite honestly. Because we do have competing technologies collaborating to create a ubiquitous network that's not reliant on any one of you, it's reliant on all of you and several others. And that's, I think, been both the opportunity and the challenge that we do have competing technologies. We didn't have that with the interstate highway system. We needed a ubiquitous transportation system to move products to market and people from coast to coast, and so we have this very public highway system. When it was time to bring electricity to the farm, the REA did it beautifully, but there weren't competing technologies. Today, of course, there are more community-based power sources, things like that, but not at the time. But you all are in something where there's a lot of competition. And you're all in something that needs the product. How it gets there is not as relevant as that it gets there, right? So I think we have the makings of great collaboration among competitors. We hear a lot now today, of course, about satellite. We hear a lot about cable and fiber and fixed wireless and community-based, all of those things. And then we haven't talked a lot about mobile, but some, and not a lot about nomadic, but of course some. All of that's got to work together to get it there. But I want to ask you, Ms. Wood, as I hone in a little bit on the tremendous opportunity that I see in telemedicine in rural America. With 36 hospitals in North Dakota and still a lot of space between them. The bill we were able to do a couple of years ago, it allowed universal service funds to be used, for example, to connect nursing facilities, I think was a good step in the right direction. One of the things, though, we always hear about, and God bless Mr. Welsh for raising the fact that some of this does cost money, right? I mean, particularly in unserved and underserved and maybe profit centers, it requires some money, and we've provided some and more and probably need to do more. But at the same time, we often don't talk about the savings or the opportunities. For example, and this is what I want to get to you, in your testimony, you talked about that telemedicine, the benefit of it, the value of it. Has there ever been a cost-benefit analysis of people being able to stay at home longer, or maybe be in a community-based health center longer because they have a ubiquitous access to the experts somewhere else? Because we always talk about the cost, not necessarily about the savings.
I don't know about an official study. I'm sure they've been done. I know our facility and also Grand Run Hospital, the one that's 65 miles away, has looked at the number of miles saved. That translates to gallons of gas, the hotel rooms, the time off of work that, whether it's the patient or family members, don't have to take. Most of the savings, I think, is for the hospital and probably our primary care providers. They are able to assist these specialists. Often they'll do their visits side by side with the primary care provider in the room.
What I wonder, because you talked about reimbursement issues, right, and what's not allowable. And it would seem to me that we ought to take a real serious look at how, whether it's private insurance or Medicare in most cases, is reimbursing, how they might save by reimbursing something that they might not think is health care, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Reimbursement is a huge issue, both for the originating site and the distant site. I'll tell you, we don't really even consider, for us being the originating site, reimbursement. We often don't even bill. We will, whoever we're working with on the other end, they pay us $25 per patient, a max of $100 a day. We could do 6, 8, 12 patients. We'll get $100. We're about the patient and what makes it better for them. And health-wise, they often feel better if they're at home and they're with their loved ones, their spouse, their children, more comfortable with being at home.
Excellent. And I'm just going to wrap up my last 10 seconds here with the Aggies. Thank you, John Deere. We haven't talked about unmanned aerial vehicles and the opportunity for imagery there and the ability to use. The beautiful thing about rural America, besides the fact that they grow enough food for the world, is that they do have a lot of available spectrum. It might be owned by somebody or licensed by somebody else or just not available, but it is available. If we can find ways to enhance the imagery, there's no reason we shouldn't be able to, to change the world with precision agriculture. And I know that you're all about doing that, and I've overstepped my time, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yells back. Mr. Long, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And as a point of personal privilege, just for the record, I'd like to state that, as everyone knows, Arthur Bryant's barbecue in Kansas City would make Memphis and Texas barbecue want to run and hide. So just want to get that out.
The best never have to brag,
Mr. Aiken and Mr. Ford, in this Congress, I've introduced H.R. 4817, the Peering Act, that focuses on improving broadband infrastructure in rural America. The bill would set up a matching grant program at NTIA to make peering centers more resilient where ones already exist and create new ones where they are needed, mainly across the Midwest, where Arthur Bryant's barbecue is. Do you think this bill would help combat the strain on rural providers having to deliver consistently increasing amounts of internet traffic, including high bandwidth, video transmissions? Mr. Aiken.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Congressman. And I have to say also for the record that I will be making a road trip through Tennessee, Missouri, and Kentucky this summer, so I will have to sample the barbecue.
We will look for your report.
I will submit that for the record. But I appreciate the question, and the cost of backhaul is a very significant cost for a lot of rural providers in terms of getting to that point where they can peer with other providers. So, I really appreciate your efforts to try to do things to reduce that.
What else can be done in more rural areas? I have several rural areas in my 10 and a fraction counties. A lot of it's rural America, and I don't think that the kids trying to do their homework should be, affected differently than the kids in the city. So what else can we do in more rural areas to keep service high quality and speeds fast?
So from our perspective, Congressman, the answer is spectrum, and spectrum done in a way that makes sense for small companies. We have a ton of small providers out there in rural America providing broadband now. But the spectrum they're using is crowded. And, like I mentioned previously, we have folks who have customers within range, potential customers within range of radios right now, but insufficient spectrum to do it.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Ford, do you think this bill that I've introduced would help combat the strain on rural providers having to deliver consistently increasing amounts of internet traffic, including high bandwidth video transmissions?
Obviously we're delivering, gigabit speeds across all of our footprint from Bowman to Bottineau and Williston to Wapton in North Dakota. So I wanted to make sure I said hi to my Congressman Kramer up there as well. Excuse me, Congressman Long. But yeah, we certainly, really believe that, increasing those speeds would be great. And one of the ways that we can really do that is, again, as Mr. Aiken said, more spectrum. Again, we really like the 2.5 gigahertz band of spectrum to allow that speed because it allows for interference protections and also to get through some of those tough, hard-to-reach areas through trees and woods and things like that. So yeah, we are constantly efforts to increase speeds all across our footprint.
And what else can be done in more rural areas to keep service high quality and speeds fast?
I think that the continued deregulation to allow us to keep focus on investing in our networks is very helpful, allowing us not to have teams and rooms and even a floor full of people working on some of those federal regulations allows us to do what we do, and we do rural broadband and to continue to invest for our customers.
Thank you. And I didn't realize Senator Kramer had joined us, but thank you for pointing that out. I appreciate everything this committee does and has been doing in promoting broadband deployment. I'd like to submit for the record a letter from the Missouri Electric Cooperatives about what they've been doing in Missouri. And last but not least, I'd love to get bipartisan support for my bill, H.R. 4817, the Peering Act, and hope to work with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle on this. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Costello, you're recognized. 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Ford, as you state in your testimony, you acknowledge that government assistance is sometimes necessary to reach areas of the country where there is no business case for private investment. But to efficiently leverage USF funds to the areas that need it most, we need the federal government to collect and disseminate data that more accurately reflects the digital divide. This is why Representative Loebsack and I introduced the Rural Wireless Access Act, signed into law with the help of this committee in the spring. This bill directs the FCC to establish consistent data collection practices for mobile service coverage. Can you highlight some of the problems that arise from overbuilding with federal dollars and how this committee can steer agencies to more efficiently focus efforts on the truly underserved areas of the country?
Yeah, I think, Midco has a company that's already providing, robust service, and some of the communities already had multiple providers. And of course, we had been overbuilt in many of those communities with those federal dollars. And what we've seen is there are still areas just outside those large, fairly large communities. Places like Mitchell, South Dakota, a population of approximately 15,000, had multiple providers there providing a high level of speed, but yet there are still people just not far from town that are unserved or underserved in that area. So to the extent that we can focus on those first, that will be a much better use of those federal dollars, and let's make sure that we do that in a technology neutral manner, whether it's a fiber connection, whether it's the high frequency cable or the fixed wireless technology to be able to reach those. Let's use the best tool that we have in the toolbox.
Mr. Strupp, I recently introduced the Wi-Fi Study Act to highlight the economic benefits that result from unlicensed spectrum use in assisting internet traffic management and how that will help us realize the benefits of an interconnected world with more efficient transmission of data. Can you talk about some of the roles that unlicensed spectrum can play in closing the digital divide in rural America? Second, can you also specifically touch on how unlicensed spectrum may play in the satellite industry?
Yeah, certainly, at least one of our members is working to show the value of community Wi-Fi connected by satellite systems. Wi-Fi, as you know, utilizes unlicensed spectrum, and I think it's a combination of those technologies that provides an opportunity to be able to provide low-cost services in many of the areas that do not otherwise have access to service, and that's a great combination of unlicensed spectrum and satellite backhaul capability.
Mr. Aiken, do you have anything to add on the issue of unlicensed spectrum and how the role it can play in closing the digital divide in rural America?
Absolutely. Thank you, Congressman. Unlicensed spectrum is absolutely critical in closing the digital divide. The large majority of our members who are small businesses who have been, for lack of a better word, locked out of the licensed spectrum play for too long have utilized unlicensed spectrum in the predominantly the 2.4 gigahertz and the 5 gigahertz bands to provide service. So, yeah, as I said in my testimony, additional unlicensed spectrum would be an incredible boon for rural broadband.
Very good. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Flores, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for hosting this great panel. I appreciate your testimony. I echo what Mr. Kramer said. It's been a fascinating discussion so far. In terms of what Congress has done in this area to look at rural broadband, we've helped auction off spectrum for 5G deployment. We've streamlined the permitting processes. We're helping to change the regulations so we can put more broadband satellites in the sky. We're encouraging technological innovation. And we're simply funding government agencies and programs that drive broadband development. And with that said, it's reassuring to see you all get together, as Mr. Kramer said, and offer us what we think are what could possibly be the solutions for the future. My district, 90% of the population lives in about 5% of the footprint. So in terms of population, it's mostly urban and suburban. On the other hand, 10% of the population lives in 95% of the land area, and it's rural. And so broadband rollout is incredibly important to me in terms of representing that 10% of the population that has more limited access to broadband. Congress last year was working hard to deal with this when it passed when it took my Radio Broadband Consumer Protection Act, which ensured that broadcasters were protected in the repack that followed the first of its kind broadcaster incentive auction. In 2012, the broadcast incentive auction, which raised $19 billion, was part of Congress' effort to grow broadband development and access. But that legislation had an unforeseen impact because at the time, nobody realized that the radio broadcasters had not been protected. So our legislation took care of that part of the repack of the spectrum so that the wireless rollout for 5G and advanced 4G could continue on time. And that became part of the Ray Baums Act, and that's become law now. Moving on to the next section, which has to do with regulations, last January I introduced HRS 701 that called for environmental and historic reviews conducted by the FCC or any entity regulated by the FCC to be limited to the area of impact. This resolution is part of this committee's effort to build out broadband. It promotes a more practical and efficient model for the modern deployment of broadband while respecting the oversight of historical and environmental impacts. So I'd like to start with that last issue first regarding regulatory reform. So I'd like to go through the entire panel. How important, and this is the question, how important is it for broadband build-out that federal requirements be proportional to the actual area being disturbed? So Mr. Straub, we'll start with you. It's probably not as important for you as it is for the other folks on the panel.
Yeah, certainly, because the satellite industry's issues are somewhat different than the terrestrial systems.
Right.
Our infrastructure is in the sky, so for us it's more a matter of ensuring that there's access to spectrum and that any technology that is adopted be technology neutral. In terms of deployment of the infrastructure, certainly we utilize fiber systems, but that is not typically an impediment to the deployment of our systems.
That's what I thought. How about in terms of your ground-based stations? Have you had any regulatory impacts in this regard?
So we do have issues, but it's not a major impediment to the industry.
That's good to hear. Mr. Ford.
Certainly we have, as I may have mentioned earlier, we have had some issues with the Army Corps and the permitting process and those environmental issues in reaching those tough areas. We also do feel that the fixed wireless tool can be very helpful in reaching some of those. So there is, as long as those rules are also allowing us to do that without too much burden on our company. But certainly those regulations do slow us down in doing rural broadband.
Okay. Mr. Aiken.
Yeah, I would agree with what Mr. Forty said. It's tough for a mom and pop business to have to pay $5,000 for a permit in order to hang a small radio on an existing tower. So we appreciate the help that Congress and the FCC have been affording us on permitting streamlining.
Mr. May?
Yeah, we would agree. I think speeding up the process would certainly help reach the areas that don't have service, and I think it's broader than we think, and we do those for doing it in a sustainable way.
Okay. I'd like to go to the next question. I'll ask you all to answer supplementally. And Ms. Coker-Craig, you may have a response to that. Ms. Ward, I don't know if it impacts you or not. Mr. Stroop, I suspect the satellite industry faces its own very unique regulatory impediments. Can you address the hindrances for deployment that the satellite industry faces? Yes, can you address the hindrances for deployment that the satellite industry faces?
Issues for deployment?
Yes, hindrances.
So again, going back to the point that I made before, in terms of deployment, the biggest issue that we have is access to spectrum. We have a number of companies that have announced plans for deployment of their next generation technology, both GEO systems and LEO systems. So the processing at the Commission is certainly an issue. We're going through a process with expediting small satellite licensing, but I think that the key points for us, again, are technology neutrality and access to spectrum.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back, and seeing that there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I thank all the witnesses for being here today. We appreciate your participation so much. Before we conclude, I ask unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record, and I will start with you, Mr. Doyle. You have some to enter?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I know that it's been pointed out the money that Congress has given to the Department of Agriculture's Rural Utility Service and the FCC on the Rural Health Care Program. I just want to point out that the problem in rural America is way bigger than those efforts. I want to submit for the record an FCC study here that shows it will take $40 billion to build out 98% of the country. So if we give the Agriculture Department the same amount we gave them this year, $600 million, it would take 66 years before we got to 98% of the country. So that's just a drop in the bucket, and we need to do a lot better, so I'd like to submit this study for the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Unanimous consent to issue this following list of documents: a letter from ITTA and Wireless Industry Association and American Hospital Association, U.S. Telecom, NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, ACT, the App Association, CCA, Advanced Communications Law and Policy Institute, CTIA, a blog post from NCTA, a letter from Rural Broadband Caucus members to House Appropriators, Chairman Walden's slides, a letter from several associations supporting the Airwaves Act from Mr. Lance, a letter to Mr. Olson from NTCA, submitted by Mr. Olson, a letter to Mr. Olson from the Wireless Industry Association, submitted by Mr. Olson, a letter to Mr. Long from the Association of Missouri Electric Cooperatives from Mr. Long, and a letter to Mr. Loebsack from the Chariton Valley Electric Cooperative from Mr. Loebsack. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind the members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions, and to you, our panel, if you will respond to those in writing within 10 business days of receipt. Seeing that there is no further business to come before the committee this morning, the subcommittee is adjourned.